This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
And this is Willie Hicks from Dynatrace.
Today, we're going to talk about observability and federal technology. Hit the music, Claude.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Everybody wants to know what's going on. They want to have visibility into their networks. So does the federal government. So today, we're going to maybe chop it up into small little pieces. We're going to talk about hybrid networks, network visibility for federal information technology. We're going to drill down to some specific suggestions made by an organization called CISA. And hopefully, in 30 minutes, when you're done, you'll walk away with some at least some concepts about observability, what companies can help, and what CISA is doing to help our listeners maybe understand a little bit better. But first, I have to introduce my guest. He is Willie Hicks, Federal CTO from a company called Dynatrace, Dynatrace. Willie, how are you?
Doing well and great to be here.
Well, we set the stage. Now we got to do the hard part. Setting the stage is always the easy part, you know. During COVID, everyone's online, and in order to handle that, they didn't have much staff, so they switched everything to the cloud, to hybrid cloud, public cloud, private cloud. And what's happened is some people are looking at it and going, well, we're vulnerable because a lot of these situations weren't as carefully vetted as they should have been, and maybe it introduced vulnerabilities into systems that could not have been there if they're more careful. But we survived COVID, and now we have to consider the whole idea of looking at vulnerabilities. And maybe for the benefit of our audience, you give us just a little 20-second nutshell description of Dynatrace and the topic we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, okay. And well, first, let me just say it's, again, a pleasure to be here again with you. This is my second time. And so Dynatrace, we are an observability company. And what that means is that we provide agencies with the ability to understand their applications, their application landscapes, their software, and to understand it from what we call the full stack standpoint. So from the end user all the way to the desktop, all the way to the database. And that allows users and agencies to get unprecedented insight into their security posture, their application performance, how their users are interacting with the applications and so forth. So it really, all of this is tied together with AI. And so it's all kind of predicated on this idea of automation. So we try to do this super simple and make it as easy as possible for our customers. So
Dynatrace, we can have this conversation walking down the streets in St. Louis because big companies have problems with observability. And we can do this, in Rio de Janeiro. Everyone seems to talk about this. So let's drill down and let's talk about how companies fail, how organizations typically fail with this whole concept of observability.
Well, when I think about how companies fail, I think about it from a couple of vantage points. What I see with agencies, what I see with companies, they just try to do it themselves. Kind of, they take the DIY approach. They try to, stitch together multiple tools. So, and this is kind of this is typical in many agencies where you've got this tool debt. You've got a lot of tools out there for collecting logs, for collecting metrics. You now got the cloud, so you're bringing in metrics from the cloud. And so for observability to work, you've got to have all of these data sources kind of, combined all this data into, they call it a lot of things now, data lake houses, data lakes, and so forth. But you've got to be able to collect this data, to understand this data, to analyze this data efficiently. And what I see a lot of times is agencies, they try to do it themselves. They sometimes then throw in the middle, maybe a correlation engine or some way, and then they'll throw some dashboards on top of that. And ultimately, what they find themselves doing is just still back in the war room, trying to figure out how to solve a problem. And sometimes I also see the kind of the opposite of that, where they're not bringing in multiple tools, but maybe they're focused on one, just logs. They're just maybe scraping logs. They're just trying to use that to understand not just, their security posture, but performance. And when there are problems, they're always digging through logs to try to figure that out. And honestly, those methods, especially as environments have become more and more complex, they just don't work anymore.
So we got a big problem here. A lot of people in the cloud, a lot of people in observability. It's true with companies. It's true in federal agencies. Okay. So Dynatrace can help companies with a platform that makes it easier and saves them money to have this good observability into what's going on in their system. But right. This whole problem of what's going on is not just isolated to the commercial world. I mean, the federal government recognizes it. In fact, CISA, just in November last month, they came up with a binding operational directive saying, hey, Willie, we know what you're going through, buddy. And here's right. a few ways we can help, that suggestions. Right. And this has been a kind of a big deal in the industry as far as data management. And it's kind of a big deal, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's a huge deal. And, what CISA came out with, so this is, so what CISA is talking about here from this binding operational directive around vulnerability management, third-party vulnerabilities, very, very important. It's a subset, it's a part of the observability landscape. So this is something we need to obviously always have our eyes on. And that is, and a lot of this came from, you may have heard of this thing called Log4j. And I think probably everybody in the country at some point has heard about Log4j, and a lot of the vulnerabilities that have really appeared, not just in the last few years. This has been going on forever, but it's becoming more and more evident to, I think, the general populace that, cyber criminals are taking advantage and exploiting, weaknesses in the system. And a lot of those weaknesses are introduced through open source, through vulnerabilities. I'm not saying open source is a bad thing. It's a fantastic thing. But the problem is, a lot of times what we see with agencies, what we see with our commercial customers, is they get hit by vulnerabilities that are well known. And so, you've got these known exploits, you've got these known vectors into your application, but they're not patched. And so this is where CISA is really I should say, put the hammer down, but really saying that we have got to do a better job at vulnerability management. We've got to do a better job at continuously monitoring for those vulnerabilities and remediating those, because, honestly, I think of this as low-hanging fruit. If there's a known vulnerability out there, it should be patched, it should be, isolated, and we should make sure that, we are closing off all the avenues to our adversaries and to cyber criminals and so forth, so they can't they can't attack our system. Now, granted, it's kind of a Cold War. There's going to always be this back and forth. We close one door, they're going to try to find another one, but we've got to make sure we keep on top of these, if that makes sense.
Dateline, November 10th, 2022. CISA, got it right in front of me, transforming the vulnerability management landscape. And so I want this to be an interview that'll appeal to people who are novices and pretty sophisticated at it. But to paint the picture is that over the years, CISA has come up with known vulnerabilities. We know that. I think it's a KVE or something. So an agency can go out on their own and say, well, this software package I'm buying doesn't have any known vulnerabilities. And I think the way NIST and other organizations have structured is that the burden is put on the agency to figure it out. And I think when I read this, transforming the vulnerability, I see the transformation going, the onus is going off of our poor overworked govies to the vendors, and they're saying, hey, vendors, you got to jump in on this and help us. Is that a good summary of this document?
So I think that's a good. So you're talking about this excellent blog that was released by, I think, Eric Goldstein.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, and I think you're right. You are 100% right that this needs to be a public-private partnership. I know that's kind of always talked about and maybe overplayed, but this truly needs to be where industry, where vendors are really stepping up and providing, being able to interface with things like, you mentioned the vulnerability exchange or the KEV, I think it's the KEV, the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. So there are these catalogs, there are these databases. You're right, CISA and other organizations, they always are keeping these CVEs and these vulnerability and exploit definitions up to date. As soon as they come out, they go into these databases, they go into these repositories for, and really for one main purpose is, well, obviously they're out there, they're known, but then they can be automated. So you have to have, I think a key part of this article was also how we achieve automation by publishing these advisories in a common framework. So I think they called it the Common Security Advisory Framework or CSAF. So, being able to publish these in machine readable format so we can automate, automate the scanning, the remediation, all those other capabilities. And I think where industry really needs to play a part in this alongside all of these other topics, but there's something we haven't mentioned yet. It's a part of it, but being able to deliver SBOMs, or what we call as an SBOM is basically a bill of materials, a software bill of materials. So industry, when Dynatrace delivers software, I should deliver a full account, a full bill of materials of everything that goes into that software, every piece of third-party software, every open source, instance, whatever might be in there, because this also needs to be in that machine readable format. So when agencies run into another Log4j, they can quickly scan and say, okay, this is all the software we have in-house. These are all the vulnerabilities. This is what we need to go and remediate. We shouldn't be just like with Log4j. I remember when it happened. I remember meeting after meeting being canceled because everybody's off, trying to isolate what systems we have out there that have Log4j. So it was all hands on deck. We have to make this better. We have to be quicker at this because the longer it takes, the longer we're exposed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I come from a humble background, a blue-collar background. I had neighbors who were factory workers and refrigerator repairmen and longshoremen. And I never forget that. How you doing? Oh, I'm overworked and underpaid. This was the blue-collar lament, 40 hours a week going to a factory, overworked and underpaid. That phrase may apply to the federal government. And I think a lot of federal systems managers are going crazy. They're understaffed. They have a tremendous amount of work to do. And really what I view this as is transforming the vulnerability. It helps them manage their vulnerabilities better. They're overwhelmed. They have to do something. I think automation is going to be the key to this. They have to automate. It's just a whack-a-mole that's 20 feet long. You're running and hitting the moles and you're not getting them. So I think this is another key aspect of it. I think is having observability. What's on your system? Know the vulnerabilities, the weaknesses on there. But also this is going to help, our people keep safe. Yeah.
John, you're exactly right. And I come from a similar upbringing. Granted, I'm a little bit further south. My father was a landscaper, and I worked with him, and then he owned a little side business and things like that. But all same thing: overworked, underpaid, and I see that with I see that in the federal government, and on top of that, I am always, proud of the work we do at Dynatrace and the work I do for the federal government because, often these civil servants are, like you said, underpaid, but also and overworked, but also they're doing this out of sense of patriotism. They're obviously not doing it for the money. They're not doing this to, for fame. And so, I think it's our duty to find ways to help augment their work. I think with automation, with AI, I'm never talking about replacing people. I'm never talking about replacing the security operations centers. I'm not talking about replacing the NOC workers. I'm always talking about augmenting their capabilities, and observability does that. It helps bring in all of these, millions, sometimes billions of data points, but on top of that layer, artificial intelligence, AI. So you don't have to spend hours sorting through data, sorting through logs, sorting through vulnerabilities, sorting through all of the security information. You can actually isolate where the problem is, isolate the root cause, sometimes automatically remediate it. And then, if you trust your AI to do that, but at the bare minimum, you can then take that data and instead of spending hours and hours sorting through this yourself, take a few minutes, and then you can move on to your actual key tasks, the things you should be working on.
And prioritize too, because everything doesn't have the same value. The military guys say if you defend everything, you defend nothing. It's an old military adage from 500 years ago. Same is true. I mean, what if, let's say, System A, Gilroy Software's got the vulnerability, and your agency doesn't use Gilroy Software? Well, right. I mean, you don't have to worry about it, do you? I mean, you can prioritize where the hours, the 40 hours a week you're in there, you can prioritize and go to the right system. Maybe the Hicks system's got a vulnerability and you happen to use the Hicks system. Okay, Forget about Gilroy. I mean, the whole idea of prioritizing, I mean, how else can you be efficient with the limited time that we have?
You are so right in that. And prioritization, especially, in any of these cases with performance issues, with security vulnerabilities, especially when you have a major, kind of going back to Log4j, when you have a major outage, when you have a major vulnerability, a major issue that you need to resolve, you need to find those most vulnerable systems. You need to find the ones that are the, with Log4j, everything was a level 10, we got to get everything remediated. Well, maybe not. Maybe I should focus first on those top 20%, 40%, whatever it might be, 50% of systems that might be forward facing. They might be constituent facing. They might have access to the internet. They might have sensitive or confidential or secret data sets that I need to protect. Those are the ones I need to focus on first. There might be 20 or 30% of those that Log4j is on the system. It's not actually even being used. It's in a dormant, module, not being used. I can handle that later. So to your point, being able to actually quickly isolate that and prioritize completely, that is completely right. And using another military idea, situational awareness is another kind of key part of this. And that's I think what we're talking about. This idea that, in the military's, this is kind of one of their mindsets, knowing their environment, knowing the environment that they're working in, having as many data points as they can, because this is how they make decisions. This is how they make really quick tactical decisions, is because they have, the best information they can have at a given time. I think it should be the same way with our systems. You should have as much and the best data that you can have to make those decisions and to make them quickly so you can isolate problems and move on.
Well, if you enjoy this conversation, you may want to listen to an episode number 32. I did it with a guy named Dr. Stephen McGill from Sonatype. He talked about the SBOM, about the software bill of materials, and that gives you just a different flavor, different aspect on it. I'm going to turn the tables here, and instead of examining, the number of hours that a federal CIO puts in the office and doesn't, let's look at the vendors. And one could read this, like an attorney could read this and go, it looks like they're turning that spotlight to the vendors and saying, the vendors are going to have some responsibility here for telling the agencies they work with about known vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities in the system. Now, no one wants to talk about their dirty laundry, but, I think that's the case that's happening here.
Right. It is critical. Yes, we don't, as industry, we don't want to expose ourselves like, yes, we've got vulnerable modules in our software. But I think what everyone needs to realize, industry and agencies, is that, this is the world we live in. We all use open source. We're all using different types of different coding techniques and different ways. Now, we should be using very safe coding practices. We should be using the best practices out there. But ultimately, things like this happen. And I give a perfect example is Log4j. Almost every company out there was using it. Every agency. It was everywhere. And, and what we found out later is that this vulnerability had been there for years, but no one had discovered it. Yeah. So it just kind of proliferated. So we can't be, industry can't be just held accountable if no one knew. Now, if we knew and did nothing about it, now that's a whole nother story. Now, I think where it becomes negligence is when we try to hide things, when we try to cover it, when we try to, protect our interests by, not exposing that we had this problem. Well, we're putting agencies, we're putting our commercial customers, we're putting everybody at risk, and nobody wants to do that. So, at Dynatrace, we are very open. We publish all of our vulnerabilities. We publish our timelines to remediate them. We're very open about that. And we act upon these things quickly because they do happen. One question that often comes up with S-bombs, though, is that, if we put out there kind of everything that's used to make our products, so like all of our secrets, well, we don't have to put, down to the code level, but like all the modules, everything we're using, then sometimes there are people ask, well, do we want our competitors to get a hold of that? There are ways for us to kind of control that, but ultimately we need to do what's right for the country, what's right for our customers. And that means kind of, honestly being open and about all of this.
Willie, I'm listening to you carefully, taking notes. And every time you say S-bomb, I spent 25 years doing live radio. I always avoided that S-bomb, I'll tell you that much, and never got in trouble with the FCC because of it. So that's a little lighthearted approach to S-bomb. And
well, I don't mention it. I don't mention that going through the airport, but
yeah, yeah, you don't want to say that word either. I'm an expert in what? Hey, Willie, it's football season, and there's some silly team in town with a crazy name, and we all know that. And when a defense looks at, let's say, the Chicago Bears, they looks at and they say, oh, this is what they do then, this is their tendency, and this is their tendency. And then they go to the game, and all of a sudden they toss it to the split end. It's a new play. And so my point is that there are known vulnerabilities. You can scout a team, what they're going to play. Then there's unknown vulnerabilities. And so this is one critique of that. I don't know if it's a fair critique or not, but we can say, well, these are the known vulnerabilities. And so you think it's a fair critique or not a fair critique?
No, that is a 100% a fair critique. And, we need to, there are kind of two ways I look at this. From the known standpoint, the known ones we should just be addressing. I mean, that we know them, we know they're out there. They should be addressed. They should be addressed quickly. The unknowns, that becomes a little bit more difficult, obviously, because they're unknown. So there have to be other approaches. There has to be, and I think this is where, you start looking at your different types of security tools, your SIEMs, and all of the different types of tools you're using that. And this is where I'm obviously a big proponent for AI and machine learning and different types of approaches where, so we don't know that there's a vulnerability out there, but there are probably heuristics and different things that we can, we need to be analyzing for behavioral patterns, user behavioral patterns, machine behavioral patterns. This is where, again, observability becomes key, because understanding how machines normally should work, how, what should I see from, a CPU standpoint, from a memory standpoint, network communication, what's talking to what. If I see, something very simple. This system might have been compromised. That's not a known vulnerability. I saw no scanning. I saw nothing. But all of a sudden, I started to see traffic that I never saw before. And it's very sporadic traffic. It looks like, you got to be really, you have to look at almost every transaction, because how this system is working is sending just a little bit of data at a time. It's kind of almost trying to mask what it's doing. You need to be able to see those types. And I don't claim to be a security expert. I'm an expert in observability, and that's kind of key to, I think, observability, which I think is key to security, being able to see the small changes, to be able to understand those small changes and then to act upon them, because, it might be a normal, this might have been a code change and this activity is completely normal, but we need to analyze it.
Dynatrace.com. That's Dynatrace. No I in there, there's a Y. Dynatrace. Well, Simon Sinek wrote a book. He said you got to start with why. And I think we spent, the first part of this discussion with the why. We did a lot of why. And now we got to transition to how. And when you talked about vulnerabilities, I think traditionally the how was, let's say Gilroy Software would see a vulnerability, then I'd put up a PDF, and then maybe a federal CIA would go to my site and read the PDF and take action. And, I guess technically, legally, I announced it. It's buried, but it's a PDF somewhere. In the transition I see in this document is that, hey, let's use let's make it machine readable and be able to distribute it in a more efficient manner than some PDFs sitting at Gilroy.com that no one reads. I mean, this machine readable capability really puts a lot of muscle into this, doesn't it?
100%. And, kind of the old way of doing this definitely was, I go out, monthly to a database. I go out and vulnerabilities are out there, and over time things got a little bit better. There's more automation and more. But now I think where, and I look at it this way too, I think that where things are going is that I think industry, when they deliver new software, it should be just every piece of software needs to have that software bill of materials. It needs to be in a format, JSON format or whatever format is. It'll probably be JSON and whatever the standard is. That could then easily be translated into as part of the agency's automation process. So that's uploaded. And it's constantly just, whenever there's a version change, whenever there's an update, there's a new S-bomb. So that's part of it. Then, we're tied into also the known exploited vulnerability catalogs, and we're tied into the different vulnerability databases. So we're pulling these feeds, these sources automatically. And you have whatever method you use. If you're using agents, if you're scanning, you're using, scanning software once a week, once a month. We should always be looking. We should always be observing. And when something changes, when something, becomes anomalous, when it becomes, is not where it should be, that should be flagged. And we should have an analyst or an AI algorithm that can actually quickly look at that, isolate, does this look like it's been compromised? And then act upon it. Ultimately, I'm really big on automation of that. I believe that what we see commercially and from agency standpoints is that the idea has always been, kind of perimeter defense, protecting. You got your web application firewalls, you've got all your different perimeter tools that, really try to prevent people from getting into the environment. With COVID, what we saw is the perimeter actually extended out now to the home. So you got a whole nother aspect. So you got to factor that in. I think that, with observability, with this idea of kind of always monitoring, I say we pull the perimeter in even closer to the application. So there are a lot of platforms out there that can do basically runtime application protection. So while, maybe having an agent at the application that's constantly monitoring it for performance and all these other things, but also, do I see a command line attack, a SQL injection attack, a typical type of pattern that tells me that this application has been compromised? I should be able to stop it at the application. So I need to maybe tighten that perimeter up as well. So that's just another idea.
Yeah, I think it's all the people listening to this should take and go to CISA and read this. I think it really it puts a lot of the concepts we've been talking about, observability and the whole machine readable language and software bill of materials, and understand what you have. And it gives you the tools to actually accomplish some of the things they've been targeting. And I'm really glad we had John to talk about it. You've been listening to Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Willie Hicks, Federal CTO, Dynatrace.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.